So everyone is rolling in. Um, Good evening, everybody. We're just getting rolling here. I don't know if I've got a few things to maybe say before people start wandering in. But yeah, this is, I don't know. I mean, kind of a somber occasion to be talking about a brand that some of us, myself included, had a lot of hope for. But at the same time, there's still a lot of whiskey out there, and I don't know. Part of me still thinks that we might see. I'm hoping someone's going to come in, and I mean, Doug, maybe that'll be something we get around to talking about. Is like, what is the end game on this? There's really only two possibilities, but which direction is it going to go? While we're waiting for some stragglers, quick reminder: some of the other upcoming tastings that we've got for you. Next week, what day is that? Friday. Uh, or is that this week? That's this Friday. Edward Hour in store. We did a virtual of this, everything up to including the superb Edward Hour 25-year-old. Really love that. Next Tuesday, Harmony and Evan, I believe, are tackling Kalila. I'm not going to be around for that one. So if you're tired of me, that's a good one to register for because you won't have to listen to my voice. Next week, also Scotch Malt Whisky Society outturn tastings, both in store and virtual. Spots left for those. Archives whiskey, we actually sold this out, but we've added some more spots to it. So if you missed out the first time around, we've got six fishes and a dragonfly to sample in that lineup. What else is there on the whiskey side of things? Decadent drams, new decadent drams, including, and I'm looking forward to trying this tomorrow, the blend that Angus created for the Syndicate Whiskey Club, which is run by Kurt Robinson, one of the team at KWM, and bottled in portion of that for KWM. So we're excited to see what's in there. Some of the liquid in that allegedly goes back to 1975, which is kind of cool. And I think it might also, you know, I think I need to do a tasting next year about blends that have interesting origin stories and kind of like our Walter's Choice bottling, where all paths lead back to Edrington at some point in time. Um, After that, what else is there? Yeah, Elixir Distillers with Phil Nixon. We will be sampling the Walter's Choice, which I really need to update the photo. Some other new casks, that Bruichladdich 30 year, which is awesome. Um, there's an old cognac and Armagnac tasting coming up end of October, so that'll be fun. Still some spots. Whiskeyland, I'm really excited about this. It's not an inexpensive tasting, but there's a 30-year-old Springbank in there, some old Ben Nevis, old Tomatin and Tormore from ex-bourbon, kind of pale looking whiskeys. It'll be a fun tasting. And then Macbeth Act 2, um, which includes everything up to including a 45-year-old Bunnahabhain. So lots of fun stuff there. There's more on there and a few other things that are going to drop this week. James Bourne and I will be doing a Benromic Gordon and MacPhail tasting. So that is coming up in the not too distant future. And there was something else. Oh yeah, we're going to do a special releases, Diageo special releases tasting. Are they so special? I guess we'll find out. There is one interesting one in there, Doug. Like, I don't know if you and I had chatted about this. I know I chatted about it with Sean in the store. I mean, 18-year-old Kleinlich, that's kind of exciting. So I'm interested to try that. But Teoninich Rye, like, that's kind of fun.
So interesting, not to go too far down the rabbit hole, but Johnny Walker Experience in Edinburgh has,
Mm.
or at least used to have, a cask tasting experience where a couple of years ago they actually had a Teoninich rye in the
Oh,
basement, and I quite enjoyed it. So I'm
oh.
excited to see if it lives up to the memory that I have of it.
Well, Doug, and there's an interesting segue between Teaninich and Waterford. Sort of. It's a I'm stretching it a bit, but I mean Teaninich is one of maybe two distilleries in Scotland that uses a water filter, I believe that's, or a mash filter,
Ash
and a
filter, yeah.
hammer mill, which is what allows them to produce rye there. You can't put rye through a standard like old school Scottish roller mill. It'll destroy your mill. But the other thing I think the key there is the mash filter probably makes it a lot easier to work with that. as opposed to trying to put it in to your standard mash tun because rye gums things up. And I know this because I made whiskey in Calgary at Last Best with Bryce, and we played around with some rye and some wheat, and both wheat and rye are not easy on the mash tun. So anyway, the tangential leap here is Waterford Distillery, which we're talking about tonight, also had a mash filter instead of a mash tun for processing its malt. And this all comes down to the story of Waterford. And, I'll go through and give a quick Coles Notes version on this, but essentially, the story goes way, way back to 1792 in the town of Waterford. The Waterford Brewery was operating there. The brewery eventually got taken over by what is now Guinness. And in 2004, Guinness built a state-of-the-art brewing facility there. They spent 40 million euros on it. It's a beautiful building. I mean, I think like all government contracts these days, it has to be padded out with architecturally pleasing designs and sight lines and things, just so the taxpayer can pay that little bit extra. And in just a handful of years, I think it was less than a decade, they shut it down because they'd opened a massive new brewery in London and they just didn't need the capacity anymore. So there's this 40 million euro brand new brewery just sitting there. And around this time, our friend Mark Renier, with formerly of Bruichladdich, who helped get Bruichladdich up and running again, sold it to Remy Cointreau for, let's call it 60 million pounds, somewhere in that neighborhood, and had some money in his pocket and some ambition because he didn't get asked to stick around when that deal went down. Unlike a lot of the rest of the team, I think Mark's vision was just a little too firm. And he would even say it. He didn't want to sell. He wanted to be able to keep the project running, do it the way he wanted to do it. But they sold, and Mark decided, I'm going to open another distillery somewhere. And he basically started looking around. He saw this brewery, and he bought it for a song. Doug, do you want to so what did he pay for it?
Yeah, if memory serves, just over 7 million euro, which is
Nice.
a pretty amazing discount on that. And not only did he buy the building, which, if memory serves, the first time that I heard him do a tasting on it, he talked about not only sort of the size of the building and the sort of new equipment, but Diageo had completely wired the place so that
Mhm.
he was able to run the distillery, classic Diageo from a single
Right.
console
There
for
was
the
a
entire.
lot of Cat 9. Is that it? Cable? Is that the right cat?
That's
Um,
if you're hip with the kids, I think these days they
well,
like the cat.
I don't even know if they know what Cat 9 is. I think they just assume everything can go right through the air. But I mean, Cat 9, yeah, the distillery. So I've been there. We've got some photos. I think we'll show them at some point, and it's worth seeing. It's a beautiful site. And I want to jump into the whiskeys. But I mean, really tonight what we want to talk about is, what was Waterford, and are there maybe some clues as to why it didn't survive? And Doug, you and I have talked about this a fair bit, but maybe we should dive in here. Uh, get everyone's noses around the first whiskey. I'll pop her up on screen, and then we can begin the dissection. And I think this one is here. So I'll put it up. I'm actually gonna have to go into the back end of the site because some of these products are no longer available. Um, but we had full sample bottles of some of these. So it was just like, what are we going to do with these? We might as well do one last Waterford tasting. Sample through the range. This one is still available. Originally $110. You can have it now for the on sale, but really everyday price of 60.49 from us. I'm sure somebody else out there on the internet is selling it for cost plus nothing, but you can buy that from them if you want. So third release in the Arcadian Organic series, there was a 1.1 and a 1.2. One of Mark's many curious, quirks that he brought into this, transposed from his time at Bruichladdich, where we had Octomores 1 point, yada yada yada, all the way to where we are now at, I've lost count, 13 or 14. Maybe this year's 15. So this is a 4-year-old bottled at 50%. and it was matured in a mix of first fill ex bourbon, virgin American oak, Bordeaux, ex Bordeaux, and Vendu Naturel casks, which Mark always loved to talk about the Vendu Naturel. So Irish barley, not from a single farm. This would be a marriage of barleys. All those barleys were harvested, malted, and distilled separately. But then in the case of this, they'll have matured in casks and then be brought together in what I believe he would like to call a cuvée. So this is an organic cuvée of barley matured in a mix of casks. And Doug, what do we think about this guy?
Oh, I mean, it's fascinating when you consider that he set up partnerships with over 100 different farms
Yeah.
in Ireland to be able to pull all these different terroir into it.
Well, and I mean, broader ramifications, whether we have time to get down to that later, is what happened to those farmers and those barley orders? Did they just get scooped up by somebody else? Were they left hanging? I mean, because they produced something specific for a specific customer. I mean, those are all the downsides of stuff like this, but it was cool. I went out and saw the distillery. I went out and saw the barley shed where they stored each of the barleys in its own unique compartment. Not hermetically sealed, mind you, but like walled off from each one in a building. And he had to build warehousing. So, Doug, while we're nosing this, we talked about roughly 6 million euros. I believe you were telling me before that the still or one of the stills was acquired for free from Bruichladdich. So he did have to buy kit, but he didn't have to like fully kit out a brand new distillery because some of the stuff that he had at the brewery that he bought from Diageo could be repurposed for the making of whiskey. Not everything, but a lot of those things. And yeah, I mean, you and I were talking about this before. Let's call it 10 million pounds. Let's 10 million euros. Let's say that after acquiring the buildings, buying new equipment, opening your first warehouse, he spent 10 million euros. I mean, I guess in some ways that's not a lot for a brand new distillery, but it's also not an insignificant amount of money either.
Well, and when you consider the amount of production and wood and other things
Mhm.
that would be required in farmers' agreements and everything else,
Mhm.
you can see how it gets quite expensive quickly. So, but very malty on the nose with definitely some of that wine cask.
There's wine cast, but it's cheesy too.
Yeah.
Like one of the things I think that is interesting about Waterford is that it had long fermentations. Um, I believe it used not just commercial. I'm going from memory here, but it seems to me that it used something other than just commercial yeast. But it was interesting. I remember wandering around the distillery with Mark, talking with him about it, and I think it was interesting what he was doing with the barley and what he was doing with his maturation process. But I also felt that like it was interesting that they had these long fermentations because you know what we know about the science of distilling today is that if you really want those fruity esters to come through in the spirit in the end, you need to create them in that beer, that initial step of making whiskey. And he was completely dismissive of that. He's like, yeah, that yeast isn't important.
Which is crazy.
It is crazy. I mean, and I think for me, like one of the first little things on here was that he had this kind of almost completely inflexible vision of what was right and what worked. And anything that strayed outside of that kind of took away from the narrative that he had, which was that terroir was the most important, the barley was the most important part of the whiskey. And I think one of the things that should come out from this nosing and tasting tonight is that the barley's important, like it plays a role, but can you distinguish any of these from each other? And even if you could, there's so much wine cask and so much virgin oak that that's going to muddy some of those really subtle differences in the spirit.
Well, yeah. Again, he originally came from the wine world, and sort of came into whiskey later on in his career, and so all this went back to these terroir driven things. And interestingly, it was long fermentations with less yeast, I think, than normal. if we want to get super nerdy, but well over 100-hour ferments,
Mhm.
which is fascinating. And yes, more importantly, we got checked in the chat that it's Cat 5 back in
What
the day. So thank
what do
you,
I call
Chris.
it? Cat 9?
Yes.
Cat 7? I'm just going to start calling out numbers after cats. Um, I mean, the first whiskey is lovely. I think as far as a new single malt, a young single malt goes, it's easy drinking, it's elegant, it's fruity, it's not too rough or sharp, even at 50%. I mean, it's a little winey for my taste personally, but it's not that sour, contaminated, funky, and I mean funky in a bad way, wine cask. The wine notes are quite clean.
Yeah. Well, and certainly I think he had learned, or at least had an ability to spend a lot more money at Waterford than he did at Brookladdy when
Mhm.
they came into Brookladdy and were trying to re-rack, but were putting it in whatever they could get their hands on, where it feels like he was a bit more intentional this time for better.
Well, I mean, a lot of people. I know Graham's on the tasting tonight. He'd remember this too. I mean, there were some very un-PC things said about some early Murray McDavid and even Bruichladdich bottlings because they were pink, and it was wet fill casks, and a lot of those just didn't work very well. I was chatting with Oliver Chilton at a tasting a couple weeks back and talking a little bit about it, and a lot of times, people aren't rinsing them, they're not filling them quickly enough, so they go bad. So there's all these factors that play. Like it requires proper handling. It's not like a bourbon barrel that, you got to get around to using sooner than later. But if you leave it outside for a couple of weeks and all you do is keep it wet, it'll be fine. Like wine casks, sherry casks, they spoil because there was you know, wine in that before. It's not um, infinitely shelf stable. And I think one of the things that working at Bruichladdich, figuring that over time was that if you're going to use wine casks, you have to be smart about how you use them.
Yeah.
So the organic Gaia, nice whiskey. I think one of the things that was a struggle for Waterford in the long term is how long can you continue getting customers to pay $100 or more for 4-year-old whiskey? And I think this is a challenge that almost all new distilleries, whether they're in Ireland, Scotland, Canada, face is people are excited to try your stuff. Like we're a new distillery, we've got our first whiskey, they want to try it, and they might pay a premium at the start. But are they going to keep paying a premium for 7, 8, 10 years until you have something really interesting, especially when they can get other things for substantially less?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. It's great to try once and say, I'm looking forward to having it at 10 or 12 years old
Mhm.
with and I know even with Waterford, as we will see with some of these other ones, there was a lot of 1.1s. And so I know there were some folks that thought that they might be collecting all of them. And then we started getting well into the 20s
Yeah.
of 1.1s, which made it challenging to say the least. So
Yeah. Well, maybe before we move on to the next whiskey, let's talk a little bit about um, the mechanics of starting a distillery, producing, and getting to the point where you have whiskey. I mean, we hinted at it before. So you buy a distillery, you kit it out, or you buy a brewery, kit it out. You start buying casks, you start buying barley, you pay for heat, light, and power, salaries for staff, and you start laying down stock. And best case scenario, you've got whiskey in 3 years. It's probably not going to be amazing, but it might be okay. It might be drinkable. And then I think the hope is from that point on, you can start selling some of it to get cash flow going so you can keep financing production for years down the road. Because eventually you want to get to the point where, whether age is important or not, somewhere in the 8 to 12 year range is going to be your starting point. Like you're going to want to start giving people something that has some maturity, has some depth to it, but it takes time to get there. I mean, and before you even start distilling, it takes time to get approvals, licenses, all these different things that just back that process up. And, you know, we've done other tastings where we've talked about distilleries like Arran and Kilchoman, who were the first two new distilleries to be built in Scotland. I know Daffmill came in, but they're a bit of an exceptional case. And in both the cases of Arran and Kilchoman, they started selling whiskey young. They both nearly went broke several times. And they did this at a point where they were the only new kids on the block. Arran, starting in 95, was the only new kid on the block until Kilchoman came along in 2005. And then Kilchoman had a good, let's say, 8 year run before they had competition for new distillery. And Doug, what's the state of the market where we're in now?
Yeah, I mean it's super fascinating when you look at the business models of some of these folks. I think you had some industry folks come in, like Inch Dernay is a really interesting one where they were selling, 1 million liters of bulk spirit into blenders to kind of keep the lights on, and said they wouldn't release anything till 10 years old. Um, Time has shown that that hasn't necessarily been the case. You've got a couple of other folks like the Thompson brothers that had an independent bottling line, but we are very much in a whiskey lock really around the world. There was a lot of distilleries that have been built. I mean, Ireland itself had what, four in 2010, and now we're well over 50 inside of there, and that number's
Mhm.
probably going to increase still. And this is the crazy thing to me is there's still planning permissions being approved across Scotland, Ireland, the US with it, and there is far too much whiskey in the world, and sales are sort of flatlining. If you look at some of the sort of reports coming out from some of the intelligence sort of like newsletters and stuff, sales are flat or declining. Revenue is up maybe a little bit, but we've all seen sort of prices increase quite a bit to sort of offset that.
Mhm.
Uh, and so it's a really interesting time where there's consumers have a lot of choice. And I think there was also a time when people were probably storing some stuff in the bunker and probably have a couple of bottles. I see one or two behind you, although I appreciate you're an exception to the rule potentially.
There's
So
there's a few bottles in my stash.
one or two, and so it's a very interesting time right now where I think those of us who take the time to come on and nerd out online on
Mhm.
Waterford and other things have a lot of choices, and so it's neat to see, but it's forcing companies to go in and do things really differently, and we've seen reorganizations at the very top of most of the major spirit companies now over the last couple of months.
Yeah. Well, again, let's talk about history of Irish whiskey in a nutshell. Um, late 1900s, they were the most like well-respected distillers in the world. At one point, there were literally hundreds of small distilleries in Ireland, many of them illegal. But by the end of the 1900 or 19th century, there was about 20 or so fairly large, fairly successful distilleries. And the Scots came in with blended whiskeys. They started nipping away at this. And then you had World War One, the Irish War of Independence, and the Irish Civil War. Irish whiskey essentially got banned from the British Empire. And then the United States went into Prohibition. And so they essentially lost their global market and shrunk down to, by 1965, they were down to two distilleries. They had New Middleton in Cork, and they had Bushmills in Northern Ireland. And New Middleton was Paddy's, Powers, Jameson, Redbreast, literally everything. In fact, for most of the last, what is that time difference now? 60 years, all those brands came from that one plant in Cork. And then I believe it was 87, uh, uh, Jack Teeling, or it's John Teeling, sorry, John the father, bought an old potato ethanol plant, opened up the Cooley distillery, started making whiskey. Irish distillers who at that time owned both of the distilleries in Ireland, and so effectively all the brands, tried to buy them out. The Irish Parliament passed a law to forbid it. And that was kind of the recovery point when it started. And slowly from that point, it built out. And then you started getting, we were talking before the tasting tonight, Doug, like late 2000s, you started seeing other people come in. I know Kilbeggan got rebuilt by the guys at Cooley. You then had things like Tullamore got bought by William Grants. They built a distillery. And then there's been this snowballing. So you've had an industry that was really going from four distilleries 15 years ago and one of them enormous, the rest of them relatively small. And now we're somewhere north of 50, possibly as many as 70. And the question is can the world support that? And maybe we can answer that question or try to answer it after we taste another Waterford, just to keep things rolling here.
I think that's an excellent idea. The second Waterford is a lovely, lovely sort of fruitier nose on it, if you will.
Okay.
But yes.
Well, I've got to I've got to go into the back end of my website to pull this one up because this now is gone. So it is archived, and I will go in and find that
Well,
for
while you look for that, I mean, when you consider, I don't think people quite appreciate how large Middleton is. I mean, it's almost 65 million liters of pure alcohol a year that they're producing, and I think the next largest after that is 10 or 11 million liters. So, I mean, the largest in Scotland, well, you've got grains that are well over 100, but I mean, you're in that sort of Glenfiddich, Glenlivet, Macallan range of, you know,
15 to 20, 24 million, somewhere like that for the biggest guys. Okay. Yeah, no, I mean the scale is enormous. When you consider like 65 million, I mean there's grain distilleries in Scotland that don't even produce that much production in a year. So this is the Waterford Lakefield 1.1, single farm bottling. So Doug was talking about this earlier. Waterford had this initial concept where they were going to release whiskeys only from single farms. I think, looking back at things, one of the warning signs should have been, again, this vision Mark had to have all these things and be so unique and they'd be distinguishable from each other that you would at some one point have over 100 farms, each of them with its own numbering system, all of them traced back. Uh, but again, this is the interesting thing here, and I think you'll see a trend throughout the tasting. The cask mix up here: ex-bourbon, virgin American oak, French wine, and Vendu Natural, which in this case, there'll be more specific, port and Masala. Fermentation times, 142 hours, in this case with Maori distillers yeast. And again, what are we looking at here? 3 years old. This is 3-year-old Irish malt whiskey.
hmm. So, can you explain what Vendu casks even are for those?
Uh, you know what? I remember looking at that today. I was like, oh, I need to dig that up again. But I believe it means things like fortified wines, like port, Marsala. It could be any of those different ones, but it could also be sweet. Um, Honestly, someone's going to correct me in this before because they'll have remembered. I mean, Doug, I drank a lot of the Waterford Kool-Aid about 3 years ago, and it's mostly exited my system in the last year. So to be honest, I don't 100% remember.
I was about
But
to,
where
Kevin
is
just
Jeff when
mentioned,
we need him?
yeah, I was
Sorry.
about to say, folks can mark off on their bingo card a mention of Jeff GPT. That would usually be looking this up and already have it in the chat for it. So
But I think the idea is that these are seasoned casks, but they're ones that are not your traditional wine casks. So they're going to be a little bit sweeter. They would have been slightly higher ABV, so you're going to get a little bit of a different effect from it. And I think the interesting note for me that ties these two together, and I know that they both have wine casks, and I know that's a big note in here, but it's that fruity, cheesy funk that kind of goes back and forth between them, that and the barley. I mean, the one thing I think he did really well is he put the barley really up front. You know, would it be slightly more up front if we'd seen maybe more American oak in the bottlings or just straight American oak? Um, but even for 3 years of age, I mean, this doesn't nose or well, I haven't tasted yet. It doesn't nose rough.
hmm. Yeah, no, not at all. Considering it's three or did I see 1 month short of 3 years old for it is pretty lovely, all things considered.
Mhm.
with it. I like that one. There's almost like a sort of like a vanilla wafers and sort of like fresh red juicy apples and um, some green apple skins in there for me.
Mhm. I did just do a quick Vendu Natural are like sweet fortified French wines. So it could be like Sauterne or anything like that. Various different kinds.
You just
Um,
looked up
I'm
with
not.
Sam's note in the chat that he threw
Oh
out
no, I
there.
just used Gemini, which um, you know,
Nice.
naturally sweet for and fortified dessert wines. So um, it's a range of different things. I'm not sure things like Ratafia would quite qualify for that, but nevertheless, I mean, this is an interesting geeky kind of spirit, and I think this kind of brings up one of the other points that I thought we would touch on tonight about Waterford is they're interesting, but are these products that are made for the average whiskey consumer? Like, is this what the public as a whole, the great mass of humanity that drinks whiskey wants?
I mean, it's a great question, and again, one that is neat to try now, and I think with time, this spirit is actually going to develop really beautifully. I think
Mhm.
there now is it's in receivership. I think the receivers were trying to sell the whole thing, and I mean, we've got to be coming up to close to a year since the announcement for it, and I think things have generally gone silent on it. So,
Well, so I mean, let's quickly touch on that then for a second. You've got a distillery that has 5-ish years of production, no more than that, 7 or 8 years of production in the warehouse. You have staff, you've got brand visibility. Um, you have essentially a mature Irish whiskey in the sense that it's bottled and ready to go. You would think that that might be an attractive proposition, but I guess who would buy it? Like what are the companies out there that might acquire something like this? I mean, and immediately you'd think of Diageo, William Grant's, Edrington, Suntory Global. You could go on listing companies, and the biggest Irish or the biggest whiskey companies, Pernod Ricard, Chivas Brothers, most of those big guys have their own Irish whiskey brand. They don't need a they don't need an Irish whiskey brand. So why would they buy it? And why would they buy it at a point in time where most of them are already themselves over leveraged? We haven't really delved too much into the Scotch industry, but like that industry got way too big. There's way too many distilleries. There's way too much production. I remember, Doug, you shared something with me a couple, maybe six to 9 months ago, possibly longer, that showed it was either 2022 or 2023 that they filled, it was either 4 or 8 times as many casks in Scotland that year as they bottled. And if you think about that from just a quick, dirty math perspective, that means that by the time that production reaches maturity, you need to have grown your industry by, let's, for evaporation's sake, say 3 to 6 times to sell that liquid. And where things are at now, can they grow the industry 3 to 6 times what it is presently?
well, and if you look at some of the sales, I mean, so single malt is at the same level for the la first 3 months, or rather the last quarter. Um, is at the same level of about 4 million 9-liter cases, which is the way that they kind of
Yeah.
measure these things, as the industry was back in 2016. So I mean, you saw sort of a little ramp up, a huge spike with COVID, and then sort of a ramp down. And if you look at some of the folks who are trying to extrapolate, they sort of see that coming back up in 2 or 3 years' time. But really it's bulk sales. There's a ton of stuff now going to India in bulk.
Mhm.
Now that sort of that market has got a free trade agreement and is lowering taxes, but I mean, you still have significant multiples of
Yeah.
taxes in there, and China is opening up new distilleries. I know they have brought over a couple of groups of whiskey influencers to uh, to taste some of the Chinese spirit, which is super interesting,
Mhm.
and seems to get really great reviews thus far with Mongolian oak and other things like that. And so a lot
Mhm.
of these markets that there was an assumption that, the US and Scotland and even Ireland would be moving into. They're filling a much of their own need these days.
Well, and I want to address some couple things in the chat, but let's quickly address and maybe dive ahead, jump in on the Waterford, the Cuvée while we're chatting here. Talk quickly about India because, you know, the Scotch industry, I think, has been very slow to admit there was a problem. They've been slow to adapt to it. And those who are like stubbornly dug in have been saying, well, India is going to open up. And when India opens up, we're not going to have enough stock. And they keep saying this when India opens up. And this is this big white whale that I feel they're chasing. And you've already touched on why I think it's not going to succeed. And the main one is that most of the big companies have already built their own facilities in India. They got tired of waiting for the Indian government to lower their tariffs, so they just built their own facilities. Brown-Forman's done it, Diageo's done it. I, I mean, I don't want to list them now because I might get one or two of them wrong, but I think there's like a half dozen at least of the big companies have all built their own facilities in India. So whether the market opens up or not, they're going to have domestic production, and that domestic production is going to be cheaper, and it's going to be able to outcompete them. And even if India does open up, is that market going to pay the prices that all these brand new distilleries need to stay afloat? The fact is, I don't think they can. I don't think they will.
Yeah, no. The big marker for me was actually an email that I got today. You mentioned a Kalila tasting coming up here. It's certainly one of my favorite single malts out there and relatively undiscovered. Diageo turned off the taps years ago. So we've seen what Kalila used to be a relatively inexpensive from sort of our IB friends has been off the market. And I just literally got an email today with offering up Kalila. So, I mean, I think we're going to continue to see a bunch of this roll through. It'll again for independent bottlers, for some of the brands and other things, will take a little while to catch up and work through some of the existing stock. But when you look at Diageo's quarterly reports, I think it was Nigeria and Poland were the two bright spots that they had put out in terms of where they see big expansion coming from. So
Yeah.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say the country of Nigeria might not be the largest market out there. So
No, I mean, and half of it legally doesn't drink. And let's just say it's on the Human Development Index. I think it's not near the top. So all those things might kind of make it a difficult place to find huge success. Graham in the chat said, I feel a correction coming. I think the correction happened 2 years ago and just no one either noticed it or wanted to admit that it had happened. And, to a certain extent, I'd even include myself in that. You know, what I think is kind of obvious in hindsight is that everybody should have seen this coming. You know, all the existing distilleries, and we're straying to Scotch for a minute here, but it's the probably easier to understand one and the one with, um, you know, probably more importance in terms of the overall world industry. But you had roughly 100 people making Scotch or 100 distilleries making Scotch before 2000. There's now what, 160. Most of those 100 that were in existence starting in the early 2000s started increasing production, some of them by 2 or 3 or 4 times at the same time that you added 50 new producers. And somebody should have asked the question, will there be a market for us? And I think this is Doug, one of the things we were talking about earlier today, talking about Waterford, was Waterford always too big? Was Mark's vision, was his production, was his scale, were his costs, including 6 million euros, which seems like a deal when you consider the building cost 40 million euros. But if you're only able to sell X amount of whiskey in a year, can you even sustain those costs to get to a point where you're going to break even?
well, when you look at the Irish whiskey industry in general, I mean, 36% of exports go to the US.
Mhm.
It's a hugely captive market. And I don't know if folks on the chat have been following politics in the US lately, but there's a couple things going on with tariffs and politics over there, on top of a massive whiskey lock. I mean, every country's dealing with it, but there's no
Yeah.
whiskey lock or lake larger than the US right now.
Yeah. Well, again, some of our chat before, I saw a stat that there's 800 producers in the US making bourbon. Like Graham, he's got a great whiskey shop up in Edmonton. He's on the chat. Graham, do you have room for 800 different bourbons on your shelf, let alone two or three different versions of 800 different bourbons? I mean, things got out of control. There was an opportunity, and people were like, oh, there's an opportunity. We can open a distillery. But they forgot that other people saw that opportunity too, and they all jumped on it. And I mean, in hindsight, looking back again, myself included, should have been asking questions at that time. Who's going to drink all this stuff? But it was that 2016 to 2020 ride was such an exciting one that I think most people kind of stopped asking serious rational questions and just went with their instincts.
Well, before we get into the canary in the coal mine, maybe I'd love to ask your opinion on what you is the cuvee that we're currently on. I think we're on the cuvee.
We are on the cuvee, and I'll pop it up on screen here.
Do you find a huge difference, or are we starting to really be able to understand what some of that backbone of Waterford is, or is this simply their cast selection is so similar between sort of all these releases?
So I, it's a little bit of both, to give you a very non-committal answer, because the reality is, I mean, I think you get a sense with the cuvee of what Mark wanted to do. And I actually think this is a great bottling. I thought it was a great bottling when it came out. It was $100. I thought it was a little expensive, but I thought it was very well put together, very well balanced. The nose on it is interesting. It's enticing. There's some nice, like candied fruits, spices, those orchard fruits, the cheesy notes, they're all there. It's a lovely whiskey. But Doug, I mean, if we're going to take it back, we can talk about the macro issues like the global whiskey industry, overproduction around the world, too many distilleries in Scotland, too many distilleries in the US, too many distilleries in Ireland. But for me, one of the things that I think maybe stalled Waterford out was homogeneity. Yes, you had single farms, biodynamic, organic, the cuvee, several different cuvées that he made, but they were all variations on a theme, and they all had a similar cask makeup. He didn't do a straight ex-bourbon release. He didn't do a straight Vendu Natural release. Like it would have been interesting to see how these individual components on their own worked, and he didn't give us that. I mean, I remember talking to him when I went there around 2022, and I said, "Are you like, would you ever sell a single cask?" "No, we'll never sell a single cask." He said, "The whiskey's got to be like all of this stuff working together." And for me, I think in some ways he was his own worst enemy because his vision was of what he wanted came out in these liquids, and his team executed it, I think, as well as anyone could have done for whiskeys of this age, 3 to 5, 6 years of age. But they were all the same, and they weren't. There were differences. I'm not trying to say that they didn't taste different, but they were all in this very, very narrow band.
Okay, what I might say before I start on my next piece here is that we move on to the Luna 1.1, um, if that works for you.
Works for
But
me.
interestingly, on that point, I knew they were in trouble when they actually went out to one of these now somewhat notorious whiskey cask investment brokers who
Oh,
would go off and offer them and offered up Waterford casks that you could purchase. And I suspected as soon as I saw that because I remember Mark saying exactly the same thing. We're never going to offer that. And then, of course, the other part in all of this, which we haven't even mentioned yet, is Renegade rum.
right. Well,
So,
let's pause on Renegade Rum for a moment because I think we'll get there on that. But I think to your point about this, like all of a sudden he starts looking for a way to sell or shift inventory. And I think the reality is that by the time you get to that point, things are probably already so far down the road that you just can't, like, you've dug yourself such a deep hole that you just can't get out of it. And it goes back to one of the press releases I saw that came out, or when they failed, that the distillery failed to secure a renewal of its financing, and it had 35 million euros worth of casks maturing in the warehouse. Now, that's great. You've got 35 million euros worth of casks. That's probably also how you valued them. I think the debts were comparable. Like there was 30 or 40 million euro debt outstanding on all this. But the best year of sales he had, and it was a peak, was I think 2021 or 2022, and they sold 3.5 million euros that year. And that's not the cask value, that's the inflated bottle value when you put it out. And what that's telling me is that he had produced way too much stock. Like, I don't know how many casks he has. I don't think we've seen that data come out, but I think he made way too much. And I think for me, this is one of the reasons why it didn't work. He simply made too much stuff that he couldn't sell. And I think part of the reason he couldn't sell it was that, again, this vision of what he wanted it to be, as opposed to giving people what they wanted. As a retailer, I sometimes have to remind producers and importers that customers want what they want. They don't want what the producer wants them to want. And you have to make your product for the customer. And I think the customer that he made products for was such a narrow band that it was bound to at some point just fizzle out because he'd have a diehard core of people that really loved it, and then everybody else would move on to the next latest and greatest thing.
Consumer is always right.
Consumer is always right, even when they're not. I'm sure Graham could tell stories about that too, as much as I could. Um, I have to remind my staff of that sometimes. The customer is always right. I don't think we shared this, but let me put it up on screen. The Biodynamic Luna. Um, I mean, again, some of the names, Arcadian, like, and there was rationale and reasoning behind them. The Luna, all these different things. I think they had clever marketing, they had clever packaging, they had cool looking bottles. It's a brand that had a lot of potential, but I think again, it just ended up being too tightly focused on what they wanted. So once again, here, First Fill X bourbon, Virgin American oak, Bordeaux X wine casks, and Vendu Naturel. And yeah, great
Well,
price right now on sale, $63. Uh, was 115, so it's basically half price, close enough to half price. Um,
well, one of the questions in the chat was from Dave. How long is it going to take to drink through all of this?
all, all of it. Well, I mean,
I mean, just in the industry in general, right? When we talk about this, and if we go back to 83, I mean, we had decades
yeah.
to get through it all, really.
Well, yeah, they said in the early 80s the whiskey lock was so great in Scotland it could never be drank. Now, obviously, that was foolish. If you give people enough time and you sell old whiskeys at going back shockingly reasonable prices for long enough, they'll drink it. Like, and they did. Things got caught up. I think the interesting thing, the reflection for me on this, on the boom bust cycle for the whiskey industry, and I wrote a quick one pager. If anyone wants to see it, just email me and I'll send it. And it talked about the three boom and bust cycles that came up until the current one, which we've gone through or still in the process of going through, is that by the time you spot an opportunity to open a distillery, it's too late because you needed to have been making whiskey 3 to 5 years before that so that you had product to sell when the market demand was there. And if you look back at the Victorian whiskey boom of the late 19th century and the whiskey boom of the 60s and 70s, as soon as all that product production came online in the late 70s and early 80s, and in the case of the Victorian boom, right around the late 1890s, the industry was ready to collapse. It went for this 20-year period of growth. And those first 5 years, if you were smart enough or like just lucky enough to catch them, that was your window. You get your planning permission, you build your distillery, you put down casks, and before the bus cycle ends, you had 10, 15-year-old product and you're making a profit. And I think if you don't hit that timing, you're in trouble. And honestly, like all these distilleries in Ireland and Scotland, it is really hard to see how most of these new distilleries, like more than half, will survive 10, 15 years because I just don't think they have the staying power that the big guys do, whose like plants and things were primarily paid off decades ago, and they took out fractional loans to cover upgrades. Compared to what all these new distilleries have, like that's that's a rounding error. And I think that's the ultimate long-term problem.
Well, and I think we continue to hear issues across multiple countries and industries where I know financing for folks has really dried up. There was
Mhm.
a time when you could take out loans against existing stocks. Certainly, extending those loans is not possible. Some of them are being recalled.
Mhm.
Reconciliations of debt and everything else are going to be really interesting. So,
Well, I know there's at least a couple people on tonight's tasting who dabble in forms of finance and trading, and they might be shocked to learn that like the Scotch industry allowed, and Doug, you corrected this figure for me. They allowed you to borrow 80% of the value of your current stocks against that to produce more. And there was only one other time in history that you could do this, and it was during the Victorian whiskey boom in the late 19th century, and that caused a house of cards, and it collapsed. I mean, the Pattison brothers from Leith, Pattison Elder and Co. I mean, they were more than just over leveraged. They were also flat out selling things they didn't have in Ponzi scheme territory. But it was this mania where the banks fueled it. Like in a way, you feel bad for these people that had a vision to build something unique, something that had a great story, something that they felt would be, you know, in demand and unique. And the industry and the finance companies that backed it were like, sure, here's some money. Go ahead and do it. And they had skin in the game as well, the people who did it, but it was fueled by probably lending rules that were way too relaxed. I've either lost Doug or Doug's lost me. I'm not sure here. Or he's deep in thought. We'll see where that goes. Doug, you're back, I think.
I know my kids are streaming too much Netflix right now, I suspect, or something along
Oh,
those.
they got to entertain themselves somehow. So, Doug, let's talk about Renegade. Because I think, if we talk about the different pieces, and maybe we'll try to sum them all up towards the end of the tasting. But one of the other reasons why Waterford might not have one of the reasons that it might have contributed to its demise is that Mark lost focus and both put his time and energy, but also capital into another project. Do you want to quickly talk about that?
Absolutely. Hopefully, my internet remains stable, but apologies ahead of time if it doesn't. So, much like our friends at Kilhoman, who were looking at a place, I believe, in Barbados, Mark ultimately went out, enjoyed rum from his independent bottling days, talked quite openly about sort of searching around, trying to find distilleries to buy. Eventually got to a place where he couldn't buy a rum distillery, and so he went to Grenada and ultimately decided to try and replicate this. And so went in, originally had a 10 million euro budget to open a distillery in Grenada. Um, Soon discovered a whole bunch of issues around um, uh, not there not being enough farms. Nobody was growing sugarcane without massive subsidies. The local politicians and government folks in Grenada weren't exactly open to giving permits to somebody from the outside. So they ultimately actually brought on the master distiller from Westerhall on the other side of the island, another distillery to help smooth that out. They ended up actually having to open their own farms to grow terroir-driven sugarcane. Soon discovered it was massively complicated. I mean, barley you can pull off and store for quite some time. Fresh cane juice, you literally have hours between when you pick it and when it needs to be pressed and fermented, or else it's spoiled.
Hmm.
And so a 10 million pound euro budget soon went to 20, went to 30, and allegedly the last I had heard was it capped out at about 40 million euros, which considering the size of Renegade
Hmm.
versus even Waterford, when you look at Waterford
Yeah.
being at about that same amount, is just absolutely insane. And so the investors, everyone who was there and made probably quite a bit of money off the Brooklady um, deal had no more for both Renegade and Waterford. And so
Hmm.
allegedly Renegade is up and running a little bit now
Yeah.
under some sort of different scheme. But
Do
very
you
sad.
do you remember seeing what they ended up acquiring it for, or has that not been disclosed?
So I don't even know if it is, they had announced somebody was coming in to acquire it. I don't know if that's ever actually closed. I don't know if there was some sort of bridge financing from the government there, but
Hmm.
they've closed most of the farms that they were procuring the
Yeah.
fresh cane juice from. They've laid off most of the distillery team. They bragged about having an all-female distillery team. So again, I remember being on a tasting with Mark, I think with you, and I asked him point blank if he would do Waterford again, and you could see the pain on his face, or rather, Renegade again. You
Yeah.
could see the pain on his face,
Yeah.
and he said it's been quite the quandary. So.
Well, and I don't know if this is exactly a secret. Maybe I won't share names, but there was another Scottish distiller on the island of Isla that had plans to build a rum distillery in the Caribbean. And I think they saw what happened at Renegade and decided to cut their losses. They basically walked away from their initial investments in it because they're like, this is a this is a big mistake.
Yes.
And yeah, really sad. I mean, I think one of the things about Mark, I mean, we talked about this earlier today. The guy was infectious in his enthusiasm, his passion, his vision. And while I didn't always agree with it, like I think as a person, you naturally want to see those people succeed. You don't want to see them fail. And, you know, I think even if his distillery had been smaller, even if he hadn't opened Renegade, you know, Waterford still would have been a struggle to get to 15 years. And I think that some of the other things like the vision, and we haven't even talked really, I mean, but we could go down so many rabbit holes tonight about how he had his own agronomist. Like he had all these things that other distilleries don't even bother considering that are just, one more mouth to feed for a business that really needs to be lean and mean to get to the point where it breaks even. And then maybe you have the luxury of doing crazy stuff like paying someone to sit in a Bentley at the front gate and decide who does and who doesn't get to come into your distillery for a tour.
We were having such a nice conversation. You had to bring up McAllen like
Well,
that.
I mean, who doesn't like taking the odd sly little, jab at the
Oh.
McAllen? Well,
Um,
I've lost where we are. I think we're on Heritage Hunter.
are we? I was finishing off Luna 1.1, but yes. Why don't we jump on to Heritage Hunter?
Okay, we're gonna jump on to Heritage Hunter. I mean, if you haven't noticed tonight, we're not focused so much on the individual whiskeys themselves as we are on the overall tale, the overall story. So this one is also no longer available, the Waterford Heritage Hunter. It was exclusive to Kensington Wine Market while it was available. This is an interesting story because, like, and this shows you, I think, an example of Mark's passion, but where I think he got carried away and distracted from the original business. And this is the story of them reviving a heritage strain of barley, and all the things it took to do that, to get it to a point where they could grow up and harvest a crop of this barley and then make whiskey from it. And, again, Doug, let's talk about things like barley. If you're buying from a commercial malting plant, there's economies of scale there, there's efficiencies there that you can take advantage of. But if you're dealing directly with farmers, buying the barley from them, putting it in a silo, paying for someone to truck it away and malt it and then bring it back to you, like just, I mean, knowing what we know about guys that floor malt and how that's three times the cost of a commercial malting plant. Like the cost of their barley must have been four or five times minimum what it would have cost to just buy commercial malt from a plant.
Yes, yes. I mean, really, I don't want to belabor and pile on too much, but these are not high margin businesses, right? You look at some folks like Springbank who are still doing floor maltings, everything on site,
Mhm.
employing small armies of people versus some of these massive distilleries that have, somebody on a console and one person rolling around barrels in the background and, a security guard at the front in a Bentley and not much else.
Yeah.
So um, it comes in very, very quickly, especially in these big swings for it. And when you look at some of these other folks, I mean, you look at these icons that have come in, like Billy Walker comes to mind, right?
Mhm.
Another gentleman came in, bought up distilleries, ultimately voted against selling out for it, but went on and now with Glen Alki has come in with only one or two other partners, has really been able to control his destiny, but came into a distillery with a
Mhm.
massive amount of sitting stock. I mean,
Mhm.
Sukhinder Singh and his brother Rajbir with Terroir and even Port Natruan that they're opening now. If the rumors are anywhere close to true in terms of what he sold the whiskey exchange and his real estate portfolio for, to buy Tormore and open Port Natruan, then he certainly got a little bit of cash to sit on, but
Cushion. Yeah.
massive businesses that just cost,
Mhm.
millions of dollars when you're looking at production numbers of millions of liters a year.
Well, I mean, there's that old joke, Doug, like, how do you become, and I think I've heard it mostly with relation to wineries. Like, how do you become a millionaire owner of a winery? And it's like you start with $1 billion. And I think there's some truth to this as well. I mean, you know, look at the Grant family that has owned Glenfarclas now since 1865, nearly went bankrupt in 1900. I mean, you know, that's a way of owning a business over time. And the costs when they started way back then were minuscule compared to what they are today, even subject to inflation. And just the reality is to start a distillery, to lay stuff down, it's so expensive. You know, I remember I asked Anthony Wills about this at Kilhoman about 10 years ago. And this is where the point where he's finally kind of out of the woods. Like, he's got enough business now to sustain the business, paying down debt, looking at reinvesting. And I remember asking him, I said, Anthony, like, if you had advice for a new distillery, and there's lots of them around, like, what would you give him? He said, take whatever you think you need to start that distillery and multiply it times four. And he said, and that might not even be enough. And I think that's the lesson here. And maybe if you're that distillery, and we had some comments in the chat here from Benjamin here saying they enjoyed that tasting with the soil scientist and the agronomist and all those owners, and they were fascinating and they were interesting. But were those luxuries that the distillery could afford? And I think hindsight would tell us that they probably weren't. And that's the sad truth of it. Investing who knows how much in recovering a legacy strain of barley and getting it to a point where you can produce enough of it to make a run of whiskey from it. Like that was probably a luxury that they couldn't have afforded. And I think the challenge with a guy like Mark, who's a bit of a visionary, is he needs somebody to basically channel those ideas and compartmentalize the ones that are not time appropriate and focus on the ones that are. And I think they didn't have that. And I think he had it at Brooklady because he maybe was the biggest dog at the distillery, but there were other dogs there that could kind of rein him in. I think at Waterford there was nobody to rein him in.
Yeah. Balance and partnerships is critically
Mhm.
important. I mean, even with this Heritage Hunter, it's a super cool idea. And
Hmm.
I think at places like Kythe Distillery that's trying to sort of build this old style of malt from the 60s with heritage blends and brewer's yeast, same with the Thompson brothers at Dornoch, but um this might actually be one of my least favorites. It's very wood forward, I find, uh,
Hmm.
for this one, and I wish them the best. I would love to be able to taste super fruity 8-year-old,
Hmm.
60s Bowmore the same way that we all imagine it could be, but um, it's hugely challenging and massively expensive
Hmm.
to even take a run at that. So.
Well, and so here, let's talk about like if you wanted to say, all right, we've brought back this heritage strain of barley. Let's make a run of whiskey from it, so we can compare it to what these other barleys taste like. I think one of the other challenges here is that you're not controlling your variables. So one of the things that popped up in the description on this is 169-hour fermentations. So, it's all well and fine that you do this, but like if you're going to do it, wouldn't it make more sense to do a run of standard barley, same length of fermentation, same yeast, same casks that you can compare it to? And they didn't. And I think in some ways there was a real missed opportunity there with something like this, where you go through all the time and effort to do this, and then you release it as a one-off, but there's no way for people to compare it or to control it. And I think it was just the challenge is like ideas on top of ideas on top of ideas on top of ideas. And again, I think Doug, we talked about this earlier today, not wanting this to be a rag on Mark because the guy had so many interesting ideas. He was so passionate. Like he is the person most responsible for bringing Bruichladdich back. There was a lot of other people there, but like he drove that forward. Waterford would never have happened without him. And he found all these incredible talented people to work with him. But the challenge was, I think, forgetting that A, the market gets a say, B, that you have to build something people want, and timing. Like by the time he started building it, it was probably getting to be too late. Like if he'd done it 5 years earlier, it probably would have been a massive, massive success.
No, I think that's probably a fair comment. And again, these folks that we all want to rally behind with these grand visions. I mean, um, not to get too far down rabbit holes. I mean, Mark took a run and came in second place when LMVH bought Ardbeg. He put
Hmm.
together a consortium. There's a great story out there about him paying to when Ardbeg closed to produce 100 casks that he went out and sold casks, one by one to sort of existing sort of customers at his wine shop in London.
Hmm.
Stories of him biking on Isla every year and stopping at the gates of Bruichladdich and trying to get the security guard to open the gates to give him a tour around and,
Hmm.
hearing about Jura being renovated 2 years before, and that was the only reason why Jura survived over Bruichladdich
Hmm.
closing at the time, and some of these other things where some of it is these big personalities, but you kind of have to have a bit of luck in there as well, and he was, and unfortunately, through a number of different reasons, we ended up where we were with Waterford.
Yeah. All right. We've got two more to go through. Um, we'll
Ooh.
move on now to the peated Fenniscourt. I did see some notes. I think it's fair to say that the Heritage Hunter was not most people's favorite based on the comments in the chat. And I mean, I think in a lot of ways it is the funkiest of the whiskeys. And Doug, just as a quick aside, try not to stray down too many other rabbit holes, but you know, Bruichladdich done some work with bear barley, and they've done a bunch of releases with bear barley. And I think in some ways it was quite polarizing too. Like some people really liked it, other people didn't. Like it had kind of more texturality to it. Um, but again, like I think maybe that's the thing that happens when you do these little side experiments and try bringing back some heritage form of barley, and you realize that maybe it doesn't work as well with modern distilling techniques as maybe you thought it would.
Yeah. Again, I love people who swing for the fences. And I
Yeah.
love that we have a peated one in here as well.
Mhm.
Um, This is almost reminiscent of some of those young Isla malts out there in some ways.
Well, I'm going to pop it up on screen here. Because the interesting thing with this is I think if you'd asked Mark in year one or year two of the Waterford project, are you going to produce a peated whiskey? And he would have told you no. And I think part of that was, you know, this idea that, he wanted it to be very specific way. But again, being a naturally curious person, he strayed from that very quickly. So 2017, some of this was laid down. And I think it works quite well. I mean, I remember these peated releases being two of my favorite releases that I'd ever had from Waterford. But again, this goes back to something I think you and I know, and maybe a lot of people in this chat know, which is that Pete somehow has a way of making younger whiskeys more approachable.
Yeah.
Peated malt at a young age is more forgiving than unpeated malt. And I think that's a classic example of this here. You can see a distinct connection between this whiskey and the first two. You can see that there is that DNA there that links them, whether it's the casks or their fermentation, all those different factors, but you've added in this little bit of peat to it as well.
Yeah. I would do we know what the ppm on this was or anything?
What have I got here for you? Yeah, the malt was peated to 38 ppm, uh, and fermented for 187 hours with Maori yeast. So
Thank
uh,
goodness. 186 hours would have been too little, I feel like, for
it
this.
would have been just not enough. I mean, you really needed to push into that malolactic territory, which is, I think, where, where we almost certainly ended up on this. Um, And the funny thing is, you look at other distilleries, like I know Ardnamurchan with their fully peated expression, they try to make it less free. Because they want, the peat to have like a signature role in it. And this is Mark going totally the other direction. This is like smoke, but with way more fruit in it.
Yeah. It's interesting. I was over in Scotland a couple of months ago, and Isla very much felt like sort of the last bastion of the old whiskey world. Prices still going up, and it was interesting. Fesh had just finished up the week before the festival there. Every distillery still had multiple years of bottles on the shelf for ever increasing prices. The only one to sell it was Bowmore because they did a single cask
Mhm.
of like 220 of the 8-year old. And I came off of Isla feeling frustrated in a way that I hadn't been there
Mhm.
in some time with it, but there is still such a love and a thirst out in the community for peated whiskey right now. With it, where again, this feels like sort of the tail end of that boom and people who still can't get enough, but
Mhm.
they are not immune either with it. But this is a lovely whiskey.
Yeah, and I think it shows some of the potential that the distillery had. Color wise, it's actually fairly pale. Like given all those unique casks that he throws in here, that wine element is still there. And I would have loved to have seen this in just straight ex bourbon. I mean, I've said that probably too many times. Like if there was one thing I wish I'd seen from Waterford, it was just a straight ex bourbon Waterford bottling. But it's good and there's potential. And I think this brings us back to maybe one of those other things. If we were going to talk about the pillars under Waterford that failed, I think one of those last pillars, and we've touched on it a bit, but not fully, is price. Um, we talked about like how long can you get people to pay $100-ish or more for 3 to 5 year old whiskey? And I think part of the challenge is that it goes even deeper than just like a simple price issue, but the brands, the distilleries, the people behind them, their business models were predicated on selling young whiskeys for a high price. And Doug, where has that gotten us? Because, and this is the related factor here. The other thing is the secondary market, which is kind of like the canary in the coal mine. Um, at first, Waterford could get those top dollars, and the bottles would sell out, and then they would go for money at auction, but that didn't last very long.
No. Well, and really, so much of the boom was really pushed to great extent by the secondary market, where there was an arbitrage to be had between sort of this whiskey or closed distilleries or some of these other things, and folks collecting it, whether to resell or to just keep in the basement for a rainy day. And
Mhm.
then sort of, within about a year of the pandemic, um, we saw prices dropping off on the secondary while sort of retail really continued to go. And, we're at a point now where, some modern bottlings, there's some stuff that you can get for, yeah, we do need to add arbitrage to the bingo square.
That's only if we don't ever want to have it completed, because I think that might be the first time arbitrage has been mentioned in a Kensington wine market tasting. I mean, Doug, with you on here as an occasional guest, that might happen more frequently.
I mean, I am one of a kind in so many ways, but
Yeah.
this is the interesting part is the value proposition, especially for those bottles. If you look at some of the folks, bottles over £1,000, $1,000 have dropped significantly. Stuff in that 300 to 700 range has come down.
Mhm.
But if you can find, if you're an independent bottler out there, and I know there's one or two on the chat, or folks, if you can find great bottles for that, 80, 100, $120, we were talking about it, $10 a year seems to
Yeah.
be a sweet spot for sort of that 20 and under. If you can find those value propositions, that stuff will disappear like that.
Mhm.
And I think it's a really interesting time now as people try and figure out this new reality. How many of these new distilleries are going to be able to compete with,
Yeah.
an Ardbeg 10, a Lafroig 10, and I know it's going to trigger you a little bit, a Lecheg 10, from a value proposition, an Aaron 10. Like there's all of these great, OBs out there that exist. Um, that are very difficult to compete with when you're looking at everyday drinkers that folks want on the shelf to pull from all the time. And so again, it's a wonderful time to be consumer,
Mhm.
a challenging time to be a retailer, I suspect, and a very difficult time for a lot of brands as they've predicated their business model on ever increasing prices.
Yeah, I mean, as speaking as a retailer, it is more difficult. I think the but in all that is that being at the like the last point in the retail chain, we have a certain amount of ability to pick and choose. So, as much as yes, we have to navigate pricing, the reality is we're now in a market where we're spoiled for choice. And for me, not because I want to be mean or take advantage, but like I think for me, the message that I have for our partners is, if you want things to sell, people need to see there's value there. And if they don't see there's value, they won't buy. And, I've had at least two different producers tell me, I think the problem, this is them speaking, is that we haven't explained to people why the price is what the price is. And I think the second you get yourself in that mentality, you've lost, because you can't justify that to people. And I, as a retailer, I'm not going to train my staff to justify to consumers why your price is X when something just as good right next to it is half the price. You have to accept the reality that if other people are selling it for that, maybe you don't have to go that low, but you have to be close enough that people are like, yeah, okay, I'm willing to spend the extra because I like the branding, I like the liquid, you know, I like the story or whatever it happens to be, because ultimately it comes down to, will people buy things? And I think we were talking about this, $10 a year for single malt scotch under 20 years, I think is a fair price. And if you're down as low as 5 to 8 years, then maybe there's a bit of flexibility. But don't try and tell me your 5-year-old whiskey is worth $150, because it's not.
Well, I think we are so fortunate, and to be clear, I am not being paid for my opinions tonight, but Kensington wine market is and Alberta in general, we are a very fortunate place right now in terms of the mass selection that we have. and the lower taxes and the ability to get a whole bunch of different stuff. And so the market is a fascinating place, and I feel very grateful, especially when we see great releases like a significant old blend that I know you just released as well. That at that age to get close to $10 a year is pretty spectacular, especially for that high of quality. It's one of these things people are going to vote with their dollars, and it's been at least 3 drams where I think I've said the customer is always right.
Yeah. And you didn't use arbitrage in that sentence.
I
So
didn't, and I
I,
held back.
I think the bingo square would be Doug uses a word that more than two people in the tasting have to search in Google.
Oh. Well, I know thankfully we don't have too many troglodytes on the chat tonight, so
It's true we don't. For those who weren't aware, this is the whiskey Doug was referring to, which is, in my opinion, our latest and greatest. 44-year-old blend. Doesn't taste like a blend. And for me, this is just, I know for a lot of people, $500 is not an inexpensive bottle. It's just good value. And for how old it is, the quality of the liquid. And for me, that's the stuff that we're looking for these days. Doug, I think you're probably to a certain amount in the same boat, but as a consumer, a drinker, I'm not really as focused on what things are as how they taste. Like, I don't really care who made it, who bottled it, or what the packaging looks like. I want to buy the liquid because I know the liquid is good. And I think to some extent, in the last 10 years, the industry's gotten really carried away with all the other things and forgotten about ultimately it's liquid and putting liquid to lips and at a price that people are willing to pay.
well, I think honestly the thing that keeps on having me come back to these tastings is it's become a bit more challenging, but still as exciting as ever to go and find, be able to taste so many different drams, to then be able to go and find a couple of bottles out of them that I really love, that I can then take out and crack open and share with friends. Because for me, that's what so much of this is about,
Mhm.
is a little bit of social aspect, being able to share a story in a dram with some friends, doing so. So for that, I'm truly grateful.
Yeah. All right. One last whiskey. And then I think we're going to forego the speed round tonight because, I mean, we haven't really been tasting these in the way that we would normally anyway, but we'll leave some time for people to vote. The last whiskey we've got here is, let me put it back up. I just had it on screen. There's the Fenniscourt. Where'd it go? Ballybannon. So Ballybannon Farm. This was another one exclusive to Kensington. Not a lot came in. I think this was around the time when, I can tell the story, the retail story from the standpoint of the importer, where the first couple releases came in, they sold like hotcakes because they were all 1.1s. The second batch of releases came in, they sold a little more slowly, but they did eventually sell out. Then the third batch of releases came in, again 1.1s, and they were kind of like lead balloons. They just didn't go anywhere. And I think that mania, that hype that drove it really cooled down. So that by the end, we brought these in, and both these peated releases and the Heritage Hunter were quite interesting. I mean, the Heritage Hunter was a little odd, but still interesting. And the quantities were small because the importer had learned the lesson that some of those earlier whiskeys weren't selling the way they were thinking they would. So um, just 48 bottles of this came into the market, 47 ppm, 167 years fermentation again, or hours, just like that um, the Fenniscourt. And then again, Virgin American Oak, French wine, Vendu Natural, Cass, and bottled at 50%. And
Yeah.
this is our last one tonight. And how
Well,
does it compare with the Fenniscourt?
it's fascinating because this is 10 ppm higher from it. And
There you
again,
go.
if you go back to Bruichladdich actually made 4 different styles of whiskey: Bruichladdich, Port Charlotte, Lockendall, Octomore.
Hmm.
And I don't think Lockendall ever saw the light of day, and has they've stopped long ago producing it. But again, sort of similar where they're experimenting with different ppms. But I think I enjoy the Fenniscourt more than the Ballybannon, but not to say that the Ballybannon isn't great and probably in my
Mhm.
top three, maybe four of the evening. So
It's I think it is a top three for me as well, but I agree. I think this is the whole less is more. I mean, uh, I don't know about you, Doug, but like we'll leave Lockendall out of the picture. But between Port Charlotte and Octomore, it's pretty cut and dry for me. Like I prefer Port Charlotte. I think the Octomores are just they're too over the top. I could have one, and then like my palate it's just tiring. Pete's lovely, but like more is not always better.
yeah, no, I completely agree. And going back and smelling these last two, and I've still got a little bit left in my glass, especially for those first two that we tried for the evening. All of a
Mhm.
sudden, some of the this fruit and sweetness is just really starting to explode with a little bit of time and oxygen.
Well, and even again for me, the cheesy notes
Yeah.
in those first two are also like these nice nutty cheesy tones. This is such great spirit, and I think um, maybe what we should do quickly is just kind of wrap this around, and then we'll have our little vote here, and you and I can declare our favorites. But I think the bottom line at the end of this is that they put down some really good spirit. I don't always agree with Mark's approach. I don't agree on the single terroir approach. I don't agree that the barley is the single most important part of the equation. I personally think fermentation is far, far more important, which he fortunately did well. But ultimately, at the end of the day, they produced good spirit. There's great bones here. I think the shame is that, you know, it was too big. It was probably too niche and too inflexible in a market that needed you to be nimble, it needed you to be lean, and it needed you probably to have started earlier than you did.
Mm.
Um,
It'll be fascinating to see over the coming years because I think again looking forward and maybe at some point we can look into the crystal ball a little bit here, but we've got a whole bunch of stuff that's maturing right now, including with Waterford, that if they can't sell the distillery soon, they're going to have to start selling off parcels of casks that are
mhm.
going to make their way into different other brands or as independent bottlers. um, with it, we're going to see a whole bunch of others that probably are quietly struggling or figuring out a way. We consistently hear sort of downturns of this. I think Waterford might be the only officially mothballed or bankrupt distillery in Ireland, but certainly I think I've heard of numerous others that have ramped down production, a couple that have stopped altogether, but are still sort of holding
Mhm.
on by the skin of their teeth. And I think that is a theme that we're going to see throughout there. And we didn't even touch on um, Uncle Nearest, right? Which is one of these brands that, much like, well, again, I don't want to get out over my skis, tip of my skis too much, but appears that they might have uh, misconstrued to the banks
Yeah.
their stock numbers.
They
Um,
they they were more Pattison, Elder and Co. than, you know, too big for your britches.
yes, yes. Well, they bought a whole bunch of stuff allegedly um, misconstrued to the banks. Their stock numbers had their sales absolutely tank with it, and might have bought some summer homes in Nantucket that they financed two or three times, allegedly.
I
Uh,
thought that their consumer base was going to rescue them by emptying the shelves of bottles.
I believe there was a push for a hashtag. However, I don't know if been entirely successful to this point.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, okay. We'll try to stay on piste here. All right, so I'm going to trigger the poll. Now, you might note from the questions that Evan didn't create tonight's poll, but I'll leave you to discover that on your own. So, Doug, if you were to narrow this down, can you narrow it down to three that you would be happy to
yes.
pick out as your favorites?
So for me, without hopefully getting too ahead of folks and influencing them. For me, the Fenniscourt is an easy winner of the evening. I think it's lovely. It's big. If you were to give that to me blind, I would guess that that's a lovely young Isla malt
Mhm.
with it, and something that I would enjoy drinking again. With it, I actually really going back to the first two. I think both of those have a lovely nose, although I think the Lakefield might be number two for me. And number three, I'd have to go back and see, but potentially the guy at 2.1, or potentially the Ballybannon brother to Steve would be in number three, but we shall see. What about yourself, sir?
I love how you snuck a little political joke in there. Accept. Um, yeah, similar. I mean, the shame of this is that there's five of them that I think are actually pretty good. I mean, none of them are really bad. That Heritage Hunter is weird. I will grant you that. I mean, it's funky in the way that like young Ben Nevis can be very funky, and you either like it or you don't. Um, but I'm going to agree with you. I think the Fenniscourt is my favorite. Uh, I'm going to go slightly different. I'm going to pick the organic, the first one, as my second favorite. And part of that is, to me, it's the most clean. It's the least whiny, I think, of the unpeated whiskeys, and it gives me the cleanest idea of the profile. And then, yeah, I'm torn. I think I'm going to go the Cuvée actually for my third. I liked the Ballybannon. I liked the Lakefield. I just like the Cuvée. I think it's nice and rounded. It's got a fun palate. I mean, if I was at a party and I could only drink one whiskey, that would probably be the one in this range that I'd want multiple glasses of. So
Well, that doesn't sound like a very fun party if you're only allowed to drink one whiskey at it, though.
it does not sound like a fun party at all. All right. Let's see how we're doing here on the poll. It looks like most of you have voted. So we'll give it 30 seconds. No, everyone who could vote has voted. So here we go. Favorite whiskey tonight is the Fenniscourt. And then everything but the Lakefield and the no and the Heritage Hunter get a vote round one. For second favorite, everybody but the organic gets a vote. So interesting. I think the Fenniscourt is the clear favorite. So that's interesting. And before any of you ask, because you weren't listening fully earlier, no, you can't buy it. It is gone. The only ones available are if you search Waterford on our website, you'll find them pretty quickly. And question three, why didn't Evan leave us with a cheeky third question? And answers because tonight's tasting is too somber a subject and he doesn't want to get canceled by Disney. Yeah, there's a risk of that. So I got my own political joke in there because it's Irish whiskey and that doesn't use it's, I guess, Waterford, an Irish whiskey that doesn't use the letter E. Because unique as these whiskeys are tonight on the scale of bourbon and Lecheg, they are just not weird enough. And because he is history's greatest monster in Doug's opinion. Um, but yeah, it was a landslide win for it's too somber. So
Yeah.
the
We'll die on that hill, though, that Evan is one of history's greatest monsters. So,
the turns out the Jimmy Kimmel question was really the winner there. And finally, are more distilleries around the world set to close? No, the only way forward is to go up, up, forever up. Some will close, but not all the ones that should, is the winner, which I love. And the sky is falling, and we will all be drowned in the whiskey lock. I mean, I think that's the best answer to that question because in some ways it's the most realistic and the most hopeful. I just realized I read those off without sharing them. So there they are. You can scroll through them for yourselves if you want. I just read them out instead of sharing them. I don't know if there was any final questions there that anyone asked that people wanted us to answer. Um, well, Dave is asking, is this current story an arbitrage?
I mean, Dave's one of those guys who does arbitrage on the daily, I feel like. So he wanted to get another bingo square in there, if
Yeah, he
any.
just wanted another mention of arbitrage.
Exactly.
Um, well, this was a fun tasting, hopefully not too somber. And for those of you who are, sad of like what was a very interesting distillery closing, You're not alone. Was really sorry to see this happen. Um, in the scheme of all the things that are happening out there in the industry right now, it's not surprising. I think I was a little surprised that it was the first big one to go. Um, but I'm still hopeful that the liquid will find its way into the right hands, whether that's with a new owner or sold off to the market, because there are people like me that I think there's a lot of value there. And, you know, however this all winds down, I hope Mark ends up in a good place because he's someone who did a lot to build interest and excitement in Scottish and Irish whiskey. And yeah, you don't ever want to wish ill on people who have nothing but good intentions. And maybe that's a point for me to end on. Doug, you got something?
No, I was just going to say, I think we always need more passionate people in this industry. And I think the more that all of us can do to try and support those who are in this for the right reasons and give us amazing opportunity to share a dram with each other, I will always go out of my way to support. So,
Hashtag right reasons. We can end with a bachelorette quote there.
okay, I just feel dirty now.
Well, Doug, thank you very much for doing this. Everyone, thank you for taking part in tonight's tasting. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun talking about this. I really enjoyed it. And I know there was one final comment in there. Will we ever see a Kensington um, uh, cast from Waterford? I really hope so. I would have done one 2 years ago, but never say never. I think there's a good chance that it might happen at some point down the line. Anyway, until next time, everyone, have a great night.